Thank you all for joining and welcome along to our ILX webinar. My name is Kay and I'm a member of the marketing team of ILX Group here in London. I'm very excited to be here today as we have over 1,900 people registered to this webinar, and we have some great content to share with you about stakeholder management. But before we do that, I just want to give you a few tips. On the right-hand side of the control panel, you should see a section, a question section. This is where you can type any questions throughout the event as they come up, and we will dedicate this last session to answering your question. You can also tweet them using the ILX webinar hashtag. So type them in. We're eager to provide the information you are looking for. If you want to stay informed of our upcoming events, you can follow us on your preferred social media platform, LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook. This webinar is recorded and we will send you via email. You will then be able to go back to the session that were most important to you and also share the link with your colleagues. Last but not least, we love your feedback and we really want to hear from you what you are looking for in particular so that we can better tailor our content. There is a quick survey at the end of this event, so please do take a moment to answer those few questions. Now, without any further ado, I'm going to hand over our subject matter expert, Andy West. Andy, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Corinne. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. As it says, I'm Andy West. I'm a project and change management skills trainer. Work across multiple market sectors. My background is predominantly in management development and people development. So I kind of have a focus on those sort of parts of project management, which is kind of what I'm talking about today. Today's webinar is to look at the reasons for project failure and the importance of stakeholders to project success. Try and look at what do I mean by a project, how to define failure in a project, and how important is our stakeholders and stakeholder engagement communication to that kind of project success idea. We'll have a look at some of the reasons for a lack of engagement, some of the kind of usual suspects, and then suggest ways to improve this. What do we need to ensure that we actually are a lot more successful and we have better kind of stakeholder engagement through the life of the project and how that might actually help our projects. Before I leap into all the content, what we'd like to do is a little kind of survey, little poll with you, just to find out about your experience and how stakeholder engagement is carried out within your own organizations. I'm going to ask three questions, and all you need to indicate is yes or no, and my colleagues will actually collate those results, and I should be able to kind of comment those back to you as we go through this, and I will be using them during the presentation as well. So, those three quick questions then. First one, within your organizations, do we have a consistent process for stakeholder engagement? So, in your projects and programs, across your organization, is there a kind of consistent process that you can follow for stakeholder engagement, no matter the size project or program that you're working on? Okay, or stakeholder engagement. And right, so yes comes out at 34% and no kicks in at 66%. Okay, second question then. Is stakeholder engagement solely undertaken by the project or program manager in the changes that you're doing? Is stakeholder engagement solely undertaken by the project manager? So is stakeholder engagement just for the project or program manager? And so it swings the other way. So yes, 23% and no, 77%. So we have a lot more people involved in stakeholder engagement than just the project and program manager, which is good news. Third and last question then. Third and last question. Is stakeholder engagement included within your project plan? So do you include stakeholder engagement activities within your detailed project or stage plan? So when you're producing the project and stage plan, are there stakeholder engagement activities included in that? Or are they something the project managers kind of does by themselves? Do you have specific stakeholder engagement activities in your project plan? Again, so for this one, we have 77% say yes and 23% say no. So actually a good indicator that we're still about planning this. So the reasons for asking those questions will probably become clear as I go through the rest of the webinar, but I'll try and make some sense of those and I'll refer to them as we go through. So thank you for answering those. First thing to consider is, what's a project? It's always a nice simple question to start with these sorts of things with. So here are a couple of definitions. First one from British Standard 6079 says a project is a unique process, a set of coordinated controlled activities, start and finish dates, to achieve an objective confined to specific requirements, time, cost and resources. So a project is all about what we do with the start and finish to achieve an objective, time, cost and resources, delivered by, spend and use up these sorts of resources. Oh, nice. Prince 2.1 at the bottom. Project is a temporary organisation created for the purpose of delivering one or more business products according to an agreed business change. So it's all about delivering the thing. So it's focusing on the product. An interesting kind of thought process here. It says in Prince 2 it's about the business case. So there is a kind of thing about benefits in here, but the focus of a project is to deliver the product, the activities, the start and finish dates. And therefore, when we start to think about failure, it's often failure is against, is it on time, is it on budget, is it the right kind of product? And when we start to look at what is project failure, and I typed in what is project failure into the internet, and I got this as a definition, which I think is actually quite a useful one. So how do you know when and why a project is failed? A project is considered a failure when it's not delivered what was required in line with expectations. Therefore, obviously, the project must deliver to cost, to time, to quality and on time. So the primary project failure things there are time, cost and quality, which is kind of the triangle we often start with, you know, what's the budget, what have we got to do and what have I got to deliver. But the important thing here is projects are about change. A project is intended to deliver a change. And if we look at things like the Prince 2 definition, deliver one or more business products, the product is an enabler for the change to happen. So when we look at projects, they kind of go, well, that's the definition, but the purpose of the project is to introduce change. Now, if I've delivered my product and the change doesn't happen, is that really a successful project? Well, I would say no. And if you look at this, and it must deliver the benefits present in the business case. So project failure is not just about time, cost and quality. Project failure is about not delivering the benefits. Now, there's often considered to be a kind of causal link. If I've delivered on time to budget and the right quality, then I'm going to achieve the benefits. But there's a major gap here. And the major gap is stakeholders. If I want that product, that output, whatever it is, whether it's a piece of software or a process or a tool or a building or whatever it is, if I want it to go into, if I want it to be successful and choose benefits, it's got to go into use. And there's that kind of gap between time, cost and quality and benefits. And the thing that plugs that gap is stakeholders. And there are many examples of projects which have delivered on time to budget but haven't delivered the benefits because the stakeholders are kind of gone, it's not what I wanted. So, you know, you launch a new product to marketplace and nobody buys it. Again, you can probably think of your own kind of favorites there. I kind of remember off the top of my head things like the new Coke, the new flavor Coke, which was a abysmal failure because people who bought Coke wanted to be different from Pepsi. That was the raw Coke. So making Coke sweet and taste like Pepsi oddly didn't do it for them. And of course they had to backtrack and it's now, it was Coke Classic, and now it's just Coke because the new one was dumped. And it's that kind of thought process that says, are our stakeholders interested? Is this what they want? And are they going to use it? This must be critical to the achievement of benefits. And therefore, in reality, is critical to project success. It's about that thought process. And the reality of this, of course, again, is that if your project is a little bit late or it's a little bit over budget, if it's not perfectly right, it will still be accepted as long as it delivers the benefits. So we need to look at project failure in perhaps a more holistic way. It's not just about on time, on quality, on cost. There's something about, and is it actually going to affect the change? So I was trying to define when change happens earlier on. So we came up with this kind of simple thought process. Change happens when you have the capability and the ability and the willingness. The project, in lots of ways, is about delivering the capability, the thing, the item, or whatever it might be. The ability is the ability of the users, the customers, whoever they might be, to use that capability. Now, as a trainer, of course, I'm immediately thinking about training and making sure that those people can actually do the right sort of things. And if you look at something like Prince 2, or if you look at something like the body of knowledge, what they talk about at the end of a project is customer acceptance, operational acceptance, maintenance acceptance. So customer acceptance is kind of, have I delivered the right thing? The operational and maintenance acceptance, can I use, does it work well, and can I use that item? And maintenance, is it going to remain in use? Is somebody else going to take over support? So capability and ability are the sorts of things we need to deliver in a project. And when you look at internal changes, internal system changes, process changes, cultural changes, a great chunk of that ability is often training, education, those sorts of things. The things that enable our users to use whatever we deliver to them. The third element then, willingness. Do they want this? Are they willing to use it? And we may well have delivered the right product. We may have delivered the training, and everybody's done the training or has passed the training. But if they're not willing to use the item that you've just installed, then it's kind of going to get left behind. And if I give you a real example of this, I work for an organization and there was a very simple upgrade to our finance and procurement systems. And rather than doing procurement locally, every manager arranging for things to be bought for their own particular team, the idea is we would centralize our procurement activity using the system, and we'd centralize the head office, and by bulk buying from head office, we can save £10 million a year directly off our procurement budget simply by bulk buying. So a system was bought and we was trained and it was launched. Now the problem here was that the system required the manager to place the order, to chase the order, to actually approve it when it came through so that the invoice would be paid. Most managers, I include myself in this group, had delegated that activity to somebody within our team and had filled our time with other things. And so when it came out and said, well, actually, you've got to take this back, what you find is that 90% of the managers went, I don't want to do this. I'm not willing to do that work I've delegated 5-10 years ago to somebody in my team. And so there's this unwillingness to use the new system. And what we found, actually, that there was a kind of backdoor, an emergency order process. We could go in locally and process an order very quickly. It wouldn't go into the roll-up one, and they would just process the order. And most of us just gave our IDs to somebody in our team who's doing procurement, and we used the emergency order so that we could just use this and it was an easier process for us. So although it was on time to budget, the benefits actually didn't happen at all. And they were talking about having to revisit and come back and do some other things. So if we look at those three elements, capability, ability, and willingness, the capability is about the output. It's about, have I delivered the right thing, on time to budget? Does it do what it's supposed to? Does it have all the requirements met? The ability is the ability of the stakeholders, particularly your users, to use what's being delivered. Now, I use the example of a system within an organization, and clearly training is important there, and therefore training should be considered to be a technical work stream in your project, because it's about identifying training requirements, it's about writing materials, it's about delivering materials, making sure that people are to an appropriate standard, particularly if we've got to it's not just training. And that's often considered to be part of our work stream. I have to say that when I first worked in projects, that bit of the project was often kind of missed. And what would happen is that teams would focus purely on the capability because this was a technically led project. And then suddenly towards the end they go, oh, but they better know how to use it. And suddenly, as a training team, would be advised. I do remember with 4 weeks to go of the project being asked, can you come and do some training for a system we'd actually never heard about. Things have improved because it is a natural part of that process. The third one then, willingness. Again, this is about stakeholders. This is about getting hold of the right stakeholders and finding out, are they able to take it on? Do they understand what the change is about, whether this is a good change, how it affects them, what they need to do? Essentially, have I got buy-in of my users? And this is an area that we're going to try and focus on today, because this is the kind of the gap. This is sometimes where those sorts of things fall over, because we launch things and people are, I'm too busy, or I'm not involved, or all those sorts of bits and pieces. And there is a problem we have in change in organizations called homeostasis. Homeostasis is the natural reaction of things that having been changed to start to revert to what they were before the change. And this willingness, this buy-in from your stakeholders is a classic part of this. If people feel they've been pushed into doing the change but they don't understand the reasons, they're not a wholehearted part of it, then what they will do is sometimes comply at the start. And then when the pressure's off, when we start, we're moving to business as usual, it's now not something new, and they kind of go, I can't remember how to do that new thing. I'll just go back and use a bit of the old way, and a bit more of the old way. And before you know it, actually what's happened is we're not doing it the new way, we've moved back and doing the old way. I did work with an organisation a few years ago now where they've done the same project essentially 4 times because of this homeostasis idea that they've done the change, but people had reverted to where they were. So it is about trying to understand what stakeholders want, what's important to them, and enabling them to actually make those sorts of change to get their buy-in. If we have a look at project failure, again, had a look at the internet, found some information, and what we found was this. Top reasons for project failure. So we've got poor planning, inefficient way to document things, poor leadership, failure to set expectations, inadequately trained project managers. As a training company, of course, I'd highlight that one and send it out to everybody I know. I will skip over that one briefly for now. Inaccurate cost estimation. Our estimating techniques aren't particularly good. We don't actually have background data on which to base our estimates. And clearly estimating is always about experience and improving those sorts of things. And then 7 says lack of communication at every level. We don't talk to people. It's not a closed loop process. Cultural and ethical misalignment. 9 comes to competing priorities, and 10 disregard of project warning signs. So people saying it's not going well and other people just ignoring that, and therefore it drifts off into failure. So the top 10 project reasons for failure, for not achieving time, cost, quality, for not achieving our benefits. And if I just click this, 6 of those are essentially communication failures in some way or other. 6 of those are about not managing our stakeholders, to include not just people outside the team, but people inside the team. So, an inefficient way to document and track progress. We don't have a way of collecting data, or if we do, we're not updating progress information accurately. We can't share the information. We don't necessarily know exactly where we are at the moment, and therefore our project is often late in over budget because we don't have the right kind of information, the wrong channels. 4, I think, is a particularly interesting one. Failure to set expectations and manage them. Whenever we start a project, there's always the kind of thing of what would you like as an output, what is it that you want? And if we talk to the users, that list of outputs is often vast. There's a whole heap of things that we want. And of course, what we need to do is prioritize those, because usually we can't deliver everything. And if we're working in an agile environment, that is a kind of fundamental assumption. The customer doesn't need everything they asked for. But if I don't then explain, well, what can we do for the time and money that we have, what can we afford to deliver, then I'm going to have a failure at some point when somebody says, well, that's not everything I asked for. Where are the other things that I asked for? So there should be, it's not just a matter of collecting requirements from people, it's about feeding those sorts of things back and explaining why we've got those sorts of things going on. So this is about stakeholder engagement, kind of the consultation bit, and then the feedback dependent on what's actually happening. Let me skip over the inadequately trained project managers. As a project program and training company, then clearly I will highlight that one later on and you can come back and talk to us. But number 7, a lack of communication at any level. Are we talking to the right people? Do we understand each other? Is the right kind of reporting control mechanism happening at all levels of the project? So again, it's about looking at stakeholders as being anybody impacted by the project, both internal to the project team and external. Now, in many methods, Prince2 is one, they often consider that controls is communication inside the team and stakeholder engagement is communication outside the team. I would consider it more holistically, and kind of communication's got to cover both parties, and therefore we should try and ensure that all of them are being trained effectively. Cultural and ethical misalignment, I think, is an interesting one, but I would link that back to expectations. If you're working on a project, one of the things you have to understand is what's culturally acceptable, how you do things, what's ethically acceptable, what's not. If you're a contract project manager, part of what you have to do is understand the environment in which you work. In fact, as a project manager, understanding the environment in which you work is kind of crucial to success. And of course, if you haven't understood the culture or the ethics of the team, department, organization you're working in, it is quite possible you do things in the wrong way or deliver things which they wouldn't possibly use because they don't fit with their culture of the organization. Competing priorities is perhaps the natural thing for all of us. If we're putting our project team together, it's very rarely that there's only ever one project in an organization, unless it's very, very small. But even then, there are competing priorities in terms of business as usual. The more common situation we find ourselves in is that we share resources with other projects, with other programs. And it's, where do I sit in that pecking order? Unless I've engaged with other stakeholders, other project managers, my program managers, about who's available, when are they available, my plan is nothing more than guesswork. It's a work of fiction. It has no relationship to the outside world. And therefore, we start the project thinking it's all going to be kind of sweet and light, wonderful. These people will be here, and they're going to do the work, and actually they're not here. And of course, priorities change. The world doesn't stop once you've started your project. So if we're not monitoring and updating those priorities, if we're not talking to our stakeholders to gather the right kind of information, what was appropriate at the start, we are the most important project, may not be true a quarter of the way in. The last one is an interesting one, the disregard of project warning signs. This says we're doing monitoring. This says that we're sending information to people. And either they're not receiving it, or they're receiving it and not understanding what it means, and therefore no action is taken. And again, firmly back inside communication. Are we checking that the message has got there? So of the top 10 failures, I've managed to link 6 of those specifically to communication and stakeholder engagement. And I'm looking at those two things together because if we're identifying our stakeholders, we have to communicate with them in a meaningful two-way process in order to make these sorts of things work. So having looked at failures, let's look at success. Let's look at doing it right. These 5 success factors come from the Association for Project Management's body of knowledge. And it talks about maturity in organizations and 5 core success factors that if you do these things, they help your projects be more successful. They don't guarantee it. Nothing guarantees a perfect successful project. What they do say is that the absence of these will make success much, much more difficult. So they become 5 things we should consider. So if we just have a quick look at these 5. On the top line then, project mission, clear goals and objectives. Have I got a clear set of expectations? Have I got timescales? Have I got a budget? Is it clear that what I've got to do, when I've got to do it by? Now, clearly there's a link from this into engagement. Have I talked to the right people? Have I gathered the right kind of information? Top management support, essentially buy-in. Have I got agreement? Now, when we talk about in projects, we look at project executives or project sponsors, and there's the first part of our senior management buy-in because they're part of this. But I might need a wider group. I might need wider support, particularly if my project is going to affect a number of other areas within the organization. So, senior management support, stakeholder engagement. Can I pick those sorts of things up? Schedules and plans, good clear plans, goes without saying. A project without a plan is a project that isn't going to work because we don't know what we're going to do, when we're going to do it. It's that structure that makes projects work. So if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So that will stick in the planning side. Underneath that, it talks about personnel, a competent and motivated team. Have I got the right people? Have I got the right skills? Do they understand how they're going to work together and what we're going to do? And clearly it's part of the leadership role to actually ensure that you have those sorts of things. And then we have client consultation. a good thing before you start. What do my stakeholders, what do my users actually want? Can I deliver everything they've asked for? Is it possible to achieve all of those sorts of clear goals? Now, of course, that might be about prioritization. It may well be that we're making the assumption, in agile terms perhaps, that not everything they ask for is actually critical. Do I have a way of doing that? And have we agreed that? Is there that two-way process where the requirements are coming in and been prioritized, and there's a clear understanding of what we will be doing, what we may be doing, and perhaps what we won't be doing? Without that, it is going to be difficult when we come along. And if I just bring this forward, in terms of taking that client consultation, this essentially is a quote from the Effective Change Manager's Handbook. It just says that stakeholder management, or stakeholder engagement rather, is pivotal to the whole process of effective. If you want change to happen, your stakeholders must be engaged, they must be on side, they must be willing to use whatever you're delivering in terms of the capability. So they must have the ability to do so and the willingness to do so. And without that, we're going to make it difficult. So the ability to engage people, to get them linked to the project, to get that kind of buy-in is going to be crucial. It talks about being the pull competence. How do I drag people through this? And if I give you an example of this, this is about hearts and minds. This is about sometimes positioning things. A while ago, before I worked for ILX, I worked for a utility. Now, when I joined, it had been privatized. But if you looked at the staffing groups, most of them have been there quite some time. And essentially, because it was a utility organization, it was about public good. Cost and benefits, cost and profits were not really anything that was talked about. It was, if it needs to be done, we should do it, and we should do it in the best way possible. And because we're a public utility, we can actually look at funding, and we'll do the right sort of things because it's about serving the public essentially. As a privatized utility, there needs to be a different kind of understanding, a different kind of culture. And I have to say that when the organisation had been privatised, when I first joined, the communication process to the staff was failing badly because staff are going, we're here for public health, we're here for public good. And the senior management saying, we've got to make a profit, we've got to make a profit, we've got to make a profit. And those two messages just don't correlate. And therefore, there's a kind of cognitive bias. Staff are kind of going, they're not talking the same language, I don't need to listen to that, that's not for me. And the problem then is, of course, we haven't got a buy-in to change. We haven't got an understanding of what's actually needed. So there were two things. First off, the message from senior management was changed. And the message was changed to that we are an organisation here for public health, public good, but because we're privatised, we do not have access to government funding. In order to invest in the public good, to invest in public health, we have to make a profit. Now, that's actually using the thought process, the culture, the reaction of the staff of this is crucial, but it's adding something to it to say that actually we've got to do these things in a different way. And part of that process at one point was to run a business game, to take operational staff and take them out of their day-to-day work for half a day at a time. And this training had no direct bearing on their ability to do their job. It wasn't about how to do operations better. What it was trying to get them to understand was, what's the link between profit and investment? What's the link between making money now and the ability to make money in the future? And that kind of thought process. And it was a huge piece of stakeholder engagement, and it was about cultural change. And so it was expensive. It was very time expensive because we had to take entire teams out in one go. But in terms of the long-term change of thought, it's about this pull competence. It's about getting people to understand where you want to move to. It doesn't mean that people move quickly, but it means we might get people to understand why we're trying to move. So that becomes, if you like, why it's so crucial. It is about hearts and minds. So the simple thought process was, well, if it's so important, why don't we do it? And I have to say that from the research I did looking at projects and those sorts of failures, one of the things you'd actually say were, here are the simple things. Not enough time, not enough money, not enough skill, or it's only a small change. And these were kind of the most common reasons why we did. So, not enough time. There's a time constraint on the project. If something's going to go, what do? We take out some of the communication things. We focus on the technical. We focus on, getting the thing built, the capability. And if we have some time, then we'll find to do some communications with other bits and pieces. The same is true of the budget, because we want to focus on building that kind of technology. And those first two, not enough time, not enough money, were particularly come up where you have essentially a technical lead on the project, where we're focusing on the what we deliver rather than the change we're trying to instill. And interestingly, this last week I've been working with an airline and working with project managers at looking at defining the scope of their project much more effectively. And on Tuesday, running a workshop, and what we're using is the tool so they can, if you like, refine the scope by looking at the benefits they wish to achieve. And clearly, if you're going to achieve benefits, you've got to have had the change happen. And I had a project manager with a project about developing a new mobile app for the airline, and a project manager who's developing a new lounge facility in an airport, another part of the world. And all the benefits of the lounge and the app are about increased revenue, better customer satisfaction, better brand image, and all these sorts of things. But of course, we don't achieve those things unless people actually use the lounge or use that app. And the interesting thing with the lounge was that it looked fabulous. It's going to be an airport lounge, it's going to have a spa, it's going to have a bar, it's going to have a restaurant and seating areas and sleeping pods, and the list went on. But it was taking over from another airline's one who wouldn't be there, and it was in a different location to the current lounge they had, which is a relatively small one. There was nothing in the project plan about signage. There was nothing in the project plan about announcing it, about publicity, about a launch event or marketing. And so the project would have delivered a wonderful lounge, and then all the first and business class passengers wouldn't have been able to find it. And all the economy class customers wouldn't have actually known that they could pay extra to have access to the lounge. It wouldn't change their seat on the plane, but they would have somewhere wonderful to sit whilst they're waiting for the plane. This is particularly interesting because the airline I'm dealing with, 80% of their business at certain airports is about transit business. So they have 40,000, 48,000 people a day flying through a certain hub, and of those, 80% essentially get on another plane and fly out. Those are our prime candidates for this lounge. And yet, nothing in the project plan talked about marketing and stakeholder engagement and buy-in and raising the level of interest. So they could spend a huge amount of money on delivering a wonderful product, the capability, but the willingness, the ability of people to use it was not there at all. The other thing came up. Now, this is actually quite a good one because one of the questions I asked you earlier on was, is stakeholder engagement solely run by the project manager? And gratifying to see that 77% of you said no. We use other people to help us do this, because one of the things about this is that you require some skills. Stakeholder engagement uses quite a lot of marketing tools. It is about communication. One of the principles that underpins this that says that sometimes the project manager is not the right person to manage certain groups of stakeholders. So the point here is, have I got the right skill in there? Am I treating this as another technical work stream, and have I got the right people involved? And from the survey, the answer would appear to be, the majority, saying we're getting other people in here. But that is an important one. There's still about 25% where we may be missing out on getting the right people involved. And the last one there, it's only a small change. Well, that's often an excuse to do lots of things, don't it? It doesn't matter, it doesn't need to be thought of. All changes require movement by stakeholders. All changes require some kind, no, it's the appropriateness of this. Scalability, as Prince 2 says, tailoring this to make it work with your own project. Those are the sorts of things that we're particularly concerned with. So, yes, there should be a consistent process. Now, I have to say that in the survey, we have 2/3 of you said that we don't have a consistent process. Now, having a consistent process just means you have a framework to work to. It's something that you can slot into your projects easily. Now, clearly, it's got to be scaled. The difficulty of having a consistent process sometimes is that it's seen as I must do it this way all the time. Good processes within organizations are always written on the smallest project. On the smallest project, you must do these things. And what you can always do is, as you get bigger, you can add things to it so that you do more because it's that kind of project. This is true of all of the aspects of project management, but I think it's particularly this. And one of the important things here to consider, and this may be important for some of you out there listening today, is it depends sometimes on the market segment. Who do you work for? Where do we work? Working for a consultancy firm, training firm like I do, I'm involved in lots of different organisations and clients. And one of the classic things is working with government, local government, health authorities. Your stakeholder list in those environments is vast, just because of the number of people you impact. And therefore any project, even if it's a small project, will significantly impact your stakeholders and will need to be thought out and planned. And one of the things about this is that if we have a process and if we're doing this, we can start to look at improving the process, making it better. One of the questions when we ran this earlier on today was about, what happens if we have people who have conflicts? What happens if we have people, if we have stakeholders who want different things? Well, can we build tools? Can we build process that we can learn from to do so? And one of the thought processes about this, and it comes from, if you like, the cost of quality, the cost of compliance. Whenever you look at doing some work, there are essentially three elements of the cost of doing this. The cost of prevention is the cost of doing it right first time. Essentially the cost of training people, educating people of processes, of rules. Appraisal is the cost of audit or testing. So if we're building widgets, then prevention is training the people on the shop floor, the appraisal is the testing people and the monitoring people who look at it at the end, is it the right widget? The cost of failure, of course, is if we don't do it right first time, the cost of reworking it, of doing it, of scrapping work because it's rubbish. If we look at stakeholder engagement, the cost of prevention is about ensuring that we've thought about stakeholder engagement, that we've planned for it, that we've resourced it. The cost of appraisal would be some kind of check, either by the sponsor, the steering group, the project board, or perhaps by project assurance, the audit function of the organisation. Do we believe from our experience that what we're planning in terms of stakeholder engagement communication is going to be effective? The cost of failure is when we don't do it first time round and our output isn't used, or we get lots of queries and people say, well, I can't use it, I don't want to use it, and therefore we have to go back and do it again and repeat those sorts of things, because this could get very expensive very quickly. If we want to reduce the overall cost, then what we do is we invest in prevention, we invest in appraisal, and therefore the costs of failure are reduced. Now, the classic one here, of course, is if we have too much methodology, too much process, we've made it overly bureaucratic. So there is a balance here. And I have to say that for project managers, this is part of managing a project effectively, is to consider appropriateness. So if you do have a consistent process, what it should have is, this is the minimum we do, this is the basics we do. And then what you have available in your organisation is things I can add to it. And of course, the skill of the project manager is, well, what do I add this time round? What would make it work for this particular context? So can we reduce the cost of failure? But it is about, have I put the right kind of things in the plan? Am I doing the right things as I go through? Do we believe this is going to work? And of course, if there's that level of that appraisal that says, actually, we've looked at your plans for stakeholder and we have some confidence in them, then everyone's going to be much happier. We should be trying to reduce those costs of failure. So, as a suggestion, how should we do this? Well, again, I've taken this from the Effective Change Manager's Handbook. A simple communication planning process to pick up the stakeholder engagement and to turn it into something meaningful. The simple acronym is SPAM, so hopefully most of us will be able to remember that one from this afternoon onwards. Strategy, plan, action, measure. Strategy. This is where we particularly start to identify our stakeholders, we start to prioritize and analyze them, we start to work out who they are, how important they are, and what do they want to know from us. And who might be best to do this. So the strategy sets out all the rules. Now, if you look at something like Prince 2, it'd say that that would be our communication management strategy. if you look at something like the body of knowledge, you would say that would be our communication plan. It's a high-level document. It covers the high-level framework for our project. When I talk about plan, I talk about in the project plan, in the stage plans, have I identified who, how, what, when, how much, who's doing it, the resources needed. So the plan is my detail. And again, survey on said, do you have stakeholder engagement activities in your detailed project and stage plans? And a resounding 77% said yes, and I am highly delighted about it. Because by planning it, we start to allocate resource, we start to allocate skill, we start to allocate time to doing this. And I personally believe, because people are so important to projects, to change, to those sorts of things, that stakeholder engagement communication should be considered a technical work stream along with all the others of design and building and testing and training, all those sorts of things. Stakeholder engagement is a technical work stream. It will happen all the way through the life of the project. In every plan you produce, there will be stakeholder engagement activities. The entire life of the project. This is not something we do at beginning and end. It will happen in every stage. The action is, well, if I've got it in my plan, I've got the results committed, I'm going to do it. It's going to work because I've got people in there. Yeah, I've got the resources I need. And it's putting the rigor around stakeholder engagement. And of course, the important thing here is measuring. Is it working? Are people moving? Am I doing something? So, interestingly, when we start to look at stakeholders in an organization, are we doing some kind of survey that says, are their hearts and minds moving? Are they starting to think about change? Are they starting to do this? Now, we may have to do some kind of survey. We may have to go and pick up those sort of things. There are ways of doing this in terms of conversations, people reactions, those sorts of things. But gathering that says we're doing the right thing and it's working. And of course, here's the learning thing. If it's not, back to strategy, back to plan, can we do something different as we go through? Are we going through those sorts of areas? Are we picking up changes in what actually happens as it goes through? It's a very simple structure, and I'm sure many of you have seen this sort of thing before. But the important thing is stakeholder engagement communication as a technical work stream. Not as a nice to have, not as an extra. It's one of the things we always plan. And it is about then that kind of measure of effectiveness. Are people buying into those? Without that measure, without that monitoring, we think everything's going fine and therefore it falls over next time round. But it's about perception. Now, clearly, if we're talking about delivering this to the external marketplace, part of that measure is a marketing engagement. Are people aware of our product? Are they starting to pick it up? There's a lot of work that has to go into this. So again, this is the scalability thing of how am I measuring what's going on. And if I had to highlight the importance of that, what I'd just like to show you is a couple of definitions of communication. And on the right-hand side of here, we have one of the simplest and quite regularly used definition of communication. It's the transfer of information. We tell people things. The problem is, what we're not doing is checking that they've actually got it, that they've understood, that they're bought in, that they agree with what's going on. So there's no feedback loop in this. A better definition, and one that we've tried to adopt as an organisation, and certainly as part of lots of our training materials, is communication is to succeed in conveying information, evoking understanding. This puts a responsibility on those who's communicating to check what got there. What do they understand? What do they believe? Are they starting to move with us? Are we starting to get that kind of buy-in? This kind of definition underpins the whole process of SPAN. Strategy, plan, action, measure. Am I evoking understanding? And I guess what I'm trying to say here is that this is critical to success for projects. 6 out of the 10 reasons for project failure come back to communication, to understanding our stakeholders and to provide information, knowledge in a way that they can understand, that they can use, they can take on board. To do that, clearly we have to understand who they are and to do things in the right kind of way. So as a kind of thought process, as a kind of thought to leave you with, all projects are about change. So there's no such thing as a technology project. It's not about the bits and pieces. It's not about the box. All projects are about people. And one of the truisms that I've often bumped into is that sometimes it doesn't matter how difficult the technology is, how advanced the technology is. people can always be more difficult than technology. And if we don't focus on that, we might deliver a wonderful, shiny solution, but there's no one actually caring about it. And therefore, our wonderful, shiny solution will just sit and tarnish in the corner. Thank you for listening. Those are the sorts of things I wanted to convey to you this afternoon. One of my colleagues is going to talk to you about support courses and how you can contact us. If you have any questions for us, please type the questions into the chat box and we'll capture those. And after these messages from our sponsor, we will try and answer those sorts of questions. So please think of questions you wish to ask. And Paula, I'll leave you to take over.
Thank you, Andy. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paula Gower. I'm the Sales Manager here at ILX for the Northern Division. The courses that Andy and I have suggested today are all of those that would help and assist stakeholders and project success. All of them, 4 listed below, are offered in a variety of different learning methods: computer-based training, blended learning and classroom. So if we start with MSP. MSP stands for Managing Successful Programs. MSP guidance provides individuals and organisations with a framework to effectively manage transformational change within a project and within their organisation. Change management is a course that's based on the theory of change for the individual, change for the organisation, communication and stakeholder engagement, and change management best practice. APM. APM is a course based on the APM body of knowledge. It assesses the breadth of knowledge in all areas of project management, from strategic and commercial implications to technical, organisation, and more importantly, people management. Stakeholder engagement is a course that will cover all aspects of stakeholder management. Why ILX? Well, ILX have been in the marketplace now for over 28 years. I have been successfully with the organisation for over 11. We're global leaders in the PPM space, which enables us to offer tailor-made bespoke learning solutions to all of our clients. You can see that we are approved by Axelos, APMG International, APM and the PMI. ILX Connect. This is a support service that we offer to all of our e-learners. Over 10 years we had of listening to our customers and learners and administrators of our portal, and we understand exactly how to raise awareness to promote the benefits to maximise the uptake of e-learning. It creates awareness of the e-learning, offers continuous support for both the learners and the administrators, and offers information and guidance on exams. ILX Connect itself could actually organise launch events at the start of any e-learning and track and report on learners' progress. You'll see from the earlier discussions that all of our courses are offered in a multi-deliverable channels: e-learning, virtual, face-to-face, and particularly gamification. This comes to life even more at the end of all of our e-learning courses, where we offer an exam simulator. The beauty is that our clients can work through the e-learning at their pace and test their knowledge on the exam simulators, saving their revision answers to the revision pad, so again assisting their learners and preparing them for the exam itself. Our 3CAT tool enables us to baseline the project management competence of individuals and the capability for project organisations by supporting simple self-assessments, benchmarking against the international best practice models. Our ILX player. We're passionate and are constantly striving to exceed on our expectations for e-learning. We have now launched our ILX player, which can be downloaded free from the App Store or Google Play. And with existing e-learning login details, people are able to download their course content to the phone or tablet at no extra charge. So it's very easy to access our e-learning online and on the go. In support of the presentation today, we will be following with an email with some special offers, including offers on all of the courses we've listed today. So if you have any questions or queries, please use the details below to contact us. Thank you.
Thanks, Paula. Ladies and gentlemen, no questions have come through so far, so I'll just call the prompt. Are there any particular questions about the presentation, about stakeholder engagement that you wish to raise at this moment? There appears to be a resounding silence at the moment. No questions seem to be coming through at the present time. Rather than sit here in silence, we've got one. Hi, can we define the communication in a project as the same as social aspect in sustainability? I think, yes, it would be a simple one. If we look at communication in a project is about engaging with people about gathering requirements. It's replying to people in terms of priorities. It's about ensuring that they're receiving the right messages in a way that suits them. Now, if we look at the social aspect in kind of sustainability, how do I sell the same sort of things? If I'm trying to change people's minds, we have a project. If we're trying to get people to buy into sustainability as a concept, and I'm trying to do those sorts of things, well, a lot of that is about engagement. So yes, I would suggest that it needs that kind of plan. If we're talking about sustainability within projects, within organisations, in terms of reuse, recycle, etc., then part of that is, have I got a team buying into the same sort of things? Let me just go back. I've just missed one. Right, I've got a couple of ones. Go for it. What if I want to engage the stakeholders, but they resist or do not care, or they provide me with a specialist who's not particularly interested? One of the things we have to consider here is that it's often assumed that lots of stakeholders are resistant to change. If I have got somebody who is particularly not interested in doing it, one of the reasons is why are they involved in the project, have I got them? What we're often looking for is champions. If you look at stakeholders, one of the things to consider is Rogers' innovation model, which looks at a kind of how people react to change and those sorts of things. And it talks about innovators and early adopters and the far-end laggards who would rather avoid change completely. What you're looking for in lots of ways is, can I find somebody in the innovators and early adopters things who is willing to stand up and talk? One of the things here we have to consider is their appropriateness, their level of authority, their ability to communicate. If all of the stakeholders are not interested, one of the questions to ask yourself is, what change are we trying to do, and is it appropriate? Now, if there is it must be done, then one of the things we have to try and find sometimes is ways of making it important to them. One of the things we talk about is survival anxiety. And survival anxiety is, well, what would happen if people didn't change? What would happen to the organisation if the change isn't done? And so perhaps sometimes a way of dealing with this is to actually try and show the reasons and the generation to change. So pick that one up. There's a lot more of that in the change management course, actually, if you want to have a look at that. If we plan the project in the feasibility study, how can we find issues with money supply? One of the things I would suggest is that feasibility is often a study of what is the right output. It may be part of our project. Any costs and timescales you get there will only be best guess. What we should be doing is then going back and planning the project properly, again at a high level, and planning each stage. And I would suggest if there are issues with money supply and those sorts of things, they come up as we start doing that more detailed planning. They become clearer as we plan the project fully, and particularly as we plan stages and those sorts of things. And clearly that's a normal context thing, and therefore we'll start to look at is scope. Do I have some way of going, well, what are the things they must do, should do, could do, maybe the things that we won't be doing later on? There should be a way of reviewing what's going on. Now that does take engagement with the stakeholders. Are we likely to have constraints on budget and time from when we first start, which is an important question to ask as part of feasibility. But feasibility plans, I would suggest, do not have the level of detail that you need for organising all of those sorts of things. How to overcome opposition from service users in a public government context. Now, one of the things we have is, as I said before, there's always opposition to change. There will always be people who go, that's not the right way of doing it. One of the really nice techniques I've actually seen is encouraging people to object, finding out what their objections are to the new one, why they like the old one so much. And if you can actually take all their objections and show how you've dealt with those objections, and so the question is, are these the only reasons why you're not changing? And if I could show you a reason how we're dealing with those and how I'm answering those objections, you'd have no reason to not change. And if you can get people's agreement to that, then just knock those objections over. So there are structured ways of doing this. Again, what we're looking at here is change management and stakeholder engagement, but objections analysis is a good way of persuading people, helping people move as the thought process comes in. In the public one, it is about sometimes having to do that at a kind of broad level by understanding those sorts of things, which says go out, engage, and find out what their objections are. And then when you're doing your kind of publicity, answering those sorts of things, you go, we understand why people want, these are the sorts of reasons we've been given, and this is what we're doing to answer those objections. If you're just kind of going, you need to do this because we're telling you, people won't believe it. If you can say that you've clearly and honestly listened to them and you're listening and doing something about their objections, then people start to look in a much more favourable way. But that takes time and effort. What other tools do you suggest, other than a change readiness survey, to focus on communications understanding? There are lots of ways of measuring effectiveness of communications. So one of the things to consider is, are we getting more complaints? Are we getting changes moving slower or faster? Are we getting difficulties with doing sorts of things as we go through change? So rather than just kind of asking people questions, look at some of the practical things. When we go through change, there's always a drop in productivity, you might call it disbenefits, the results of change, a disruption, those sorts of things. Part of it is well, what's the disruption? How bad is it? Is there a drop in? Are there people saying that this is, it's not going to work? If we get an increase in complaints, if we're getting a greater than expected drop in productivity, that is often an indicator that people either don't understand what we want to do or why we're doing it or how we're doing it. They may have some legitimate concerns, which we need to make sure have been addressed. So a survey is one way, but there are lots of other things that you might consider doing. One of the things is often conversations. Are we picking up the coffee machine chats? Are there concerns around that? There's a lot of stuff that happens informally in organisations, which are hugely important communication channels, which we often ignore at our peril. So it's to look at those other sorts of things we go through. That's the same one come up. Let's just move up. What handbook on your website? What service does change management fall under? The handbook I've referred to a couple of times is called the Effective Change Manager's Handbook. It's published by Kogan Page. It was written in conjunction with the Change Management Institute and the Association for Project Management Group, who are the exam board who offer that. On our website, if you look up the Change Management Qualification, we offer it both as an e-learning as a classroom course. It is used as the reference material for that. I would also suggest you have a look at the Change Manager's Body of Knowledge, which is published by the Change Management Institute, I think Kogan Page as well, which are all the skills and attributes of an effective change manager. So those are the two things I'd use as a reference. The resist, I think I've just answered the first one. Question. Yeah. Well, we want to engage stakeholders, but they resist and do not care, or they provide me with a who's not actually interested. We've answered that question earlier on. It is about finding the right people, and sometimes finding ways in. So I talked about Rogers, finding people who are actually on side straight away. The body of knowledge refers to stakeholder management and stakeholder engagement. Do I see a difference between stakeholder management and stakeholder engagement? I have to say that I, perhaps by accident, use those two terms almost interchangeably. When we use the term stakeholder management, we are suggesting we are managing, we are trying to actually do those sorts of, manage their beliefs, and perhaps, whereas engagement seems to be a more open to a process. I believe that the two, as a person, are kind of, it's a choice. That I've not seen anything that says that they are completely different. I would suggest perhaps if you said that management is perhaps a broader process, engagement might be much more kind of the detail of how do I go back out and grab, kind of talk to them. The important thing is then the feedback process of actually ensuring that you have feedback from them, that you're showing how you react to those sorts of things. So if the two of them, engagement might be a kind of, it's the thing we do, but management is perhaps the broader one, which includes things like the measurement and the kind of fitting into the context. But as I say, I think I've probably used the two terms interchangeably, which perhaps is not the right way of doing it, but I think I've always done that. What are the tools? I've answered that one. What ways can we baseline communication controls on the project? One of the things to consider about any change you're going to do is how do people review the change in the first place? Do you have a willingness to change across the organization, or do you have resistance to change in the organization? Now, many organizations do a regular staff survey of some description, and one of the things in there is often useful for capturing baseline attitudes to change generally. One of the other ways of doing this, of course, is via managers. How are people behaving? Are there any complaints about the process, systems or tools being used? Again, if you look at things like appraisals, or if you have communication routes via managers, there are good tools to gather complaints or queries for those sorts of things. It's a matter of tapping into those. Now, the problem we have here, of course, is if we don't currently measure it and we wish to, then we are putting more measures in place. So one of the things to consider is what's really appropriate. The one thing that's often difficult about market staff surveys, if you do one once a year, there's a long gap between doing those. One of the organizations I work for used to do a staff survey every quarter, but it didn't ask everybody. It did about 20% of the organization every quarter, and therefore, randomly you might get picked twice, 2 surveys, or might not be picked for 2 or 3 surveys at a time, but everybody would get picked at some point. And the important thing there was you could start to look at changes on a quarterly basis. It wasn't something we did once a year and can't forget about. It was something that was being thought of all the way through the year. So changing sometimes your behaviours and how you do this might give you better baselines. You can start to see, are there patterns and trends? If we do a survey at different points of the year, do we get a degree of satisfaction with change or what's going on in the organisation because of the circumstances or context of that point in the year? By doing them more frequently, you start to get a better view of what's going on, better trending information. What processes would you recommend for checking communication and understanding with stakeholders? Well, conversations, speed of acceptance, speed of delivery. If you're delivering changes, how quickly are those being taken on board? What you might suggest here is if you're doing a change in terms of getting people trained for a new system, if you launch a new system or training for a new system, how quickly do people actually respond with, yes, I want to do the training, or are people being forced to go on the training? Are they waiting to be told? I would suggest if it's towards the latter, you probably have more resistance. If people are volunteering, you have a lot more people who are willing to change. So you can start to see, if you like, response rates in those sorts of things. Complaints. Do we have in our forums, do we have some kind of briefing? Is there a return loop for feedback that says, what are we gathering from staff? The problem with organisational communication sometimes is that they're set up to deliver information from the top of the organisation to the ground floor. What they need to have is that feedback loop of, well, when we're delivering information down, is there information coming back up? Are we gathering that as well? Is there a feedback loop? If the answer is no, then our communication on we have no idea what our stakeholders, our staff actually think. So it is those kind of thought processes. It's building those sorts of loops. And again, conversations with managers. The narrative evidence of my staff are happy or unhappy is kind of critical. And therefore our middle managers could be hugely crucial to this process. They probably have a lot of knowledge about how people are reacting already. What is meant when we say sometimes project manager is not responsible for? One of the things here to consider is when we start to analyse stakeholders in terms of their importance, their power or influence over the project and their interest in the project, what we might find is that there are quite a number of people who have quite a lot of authority but aren't that interested. And as a project manager, you may not be the best person to present to that particular group. It may be better if somebody who is linked or is part of that group presents to them. One of the classic examples of this, if we use stakeholder analysis, is often we start to identify that in any organisation, if you're doing a project about internal change, you may have one of your senior managers as your project sponsor, your project executive. But lots of the other senior managers have lots of influence. They could borrow your resources, they could block you getting access to money and time, equipment. They're not interested in your project. It may be difficult for the project manager to communicate with those effectively because they're not a peer group, but it may be much easier if the sponsor or executive or other members of your steering group, project board, were to do that sort of communication. So what I mean is, if the project manager is not responsible for delivering it, it may be that somebody else is responsible for delivering it on your behalf, because you're still going to run the project. So it's involving the right people to communicate with different groups. And sometimes it's not just about levels of authority. Sometimes it can be about being too different, too far away. If you've got people who've adopted the change very early, and they're trying to talk to people who are resisting the change hugely, they have a completely different viewpoint of the world. And the people who are saying, yes, it's a wonderful idea, may not understand the position. The people who are going, it's a terrible idea, I'm terrified of it. Having somebody who is nearer in experience might be a lot more appropriate. And again, Roger's innovation model starts to suggest using different groups of people and their reactions to change to communicate with the next group in the change. So this is not just about power and authority, it can be about other reasons as well. Any specific comments with client engagement within a technological project involving migrating a legacy system? Engagement seems to be more difficult to get in that case. One of the things you've got to consider here is what's stopping them changing. When we talk about change, we talk about two anxieties. Learning anxiety, I'm terrified of learning something new, and survival anxiety, what will happen to me if I don't change? If you have people working on legacy systems that are comfortable, have been working on it for a very long time, they're in their comfort zone. And they don't want to learn something new because it looks new and frightening. So can I reduce their learning anxiety so that they don't feel afraid of learning? Learning becomes kind of easier. And secondly, can I be honest about what would happen if we don't move from this legacy system? What's going to happen to it? What will happen to the organization? And this is not meant in any threatening way. It's simply being realistic of why is this critical for the organization? Why is this critical for the department? So there are lots of sorts of things you might pick up in terms of how do I sell this to those particular areas, those particular people. One of the things might be, if you are reliant on this legacy system and its support is going to stop in the next period, what will happen if you try and carry on using it without support? And what would happen in our business if we did so? And again, we might be able to highlight the dangers of not doing something. Raise some survival anxiety would be a thought process. Question: what if you're dealing with multiple stakeholders with different agendas and needs, sometimes conflicting ones? I think you're working in the real world. I think that's very common. And one of the things we have to look at here is, in terms of who those multiple stakeholders are, in terms of their power, their influence, and the critical nature of what their needs, requirements are in terms of the project, the change that we're delivering. And we can't be all things to all people, I think, is the simple answer. And therefore there will be things, there will be some difficult conversations with some people that can't get everything they want. Now clearly what we'd look for is collaboration where we can, everybody supportive of the idea. But one of the things you start to look at then is a conflict model. Thomas Kilmer's got a nice one, and it talks about, sometimes you compete, sometimes you accommodate. If you want the perfect solution, you collaborate. But sometimes we have to compromise. And therefore you might start looking at those sorts of conflict models that say, well, what's an appropriate way of doing it this time around, because there's more than one thing. So this might be about not just gathering information, it may be about using appropriate models to then bring people together to come to some kind of resolution. My simple answer is there's possibly quite a lot of work in that, I'm afraid. How do you deal with stakeholders who will not engage? This is a difficulty. If they're trying to ignore you and hope that you don't go away, one of the things you have to do is be consistent, be persistent, I think is the right answer. One of the things, again, there, perhaps this comes up to survival anxiety. What will happen if they didn't engage with us? What might be the concerns of if you don't talk to us? And one of the things I've seen there is that this old system legacy tool is going to go by such and such a date, and if we don't have their buy-in, then there'll be nothing to replace it, or the system or tool they might get replacement will not meet their needs. So again, it's almost selling the advantage of talking to you and the disadvantage of not talking to you. but you eventually have to carry on trying. This is an interesting one because we're kind of assuming that they have to talk to us. If we're in a commercial environment, to us because we're trying to sell them something, they can always go and buy from somewhere else. So we sometimes have to be a bit more careful about changing those sorts of things. But assuming we're talking about an internal environment, it's persistence, but it's understanding the reasons why. Again, we're almost talking about conflict management. What is TFPL? Initials, logo, associate. So TFPL are a sister company to ILX, who cover training across a wide range of sorts of areas, and I'm trying desperately to remember those. So the TFPL is them, they're a sister company, and they deliver lots of training, particularly they have a course on stakeholder engagement. So we're looking at the broader solutions. If you have a look to our website, I think there's a link to the TFPL website. You can have a look on there and look at those sorts of things. So that's who they are, that's where it comes from. Apologies, we should have been a bit clear on that one. Question. One difficulty is if the stakeholder sponsor is not around or too busy, and therefore communication updates can be difficult to be highlighted to them to act upon. Absolutely very true. One of the things here to consider is clearly management by exception. What do you need them to be involved with? What do you need them to react to? So one of the things here is if you have a stakeholder or sponsor who is very busy but needs to be retained, can we manage these things in other ways? So think about roles. One of the important things here is a sponsor is supposed to take ownership of the project. If they can't do lots of checking, double checking, could I use a project assurance function to make sure that what I'm being told is the truth as the project sponsor? So have I solved that particular idea? To look at management by exception clearly and kind of go, what's routine just to tell you what's going on and what needs responses? So let's be clear on what I need to respond and why I need to respond before we start. One of the things here is ensuring the sponsor has A, understood their role, and B, committed sufficient time to do so. And the important thing here is do you have the right sponsor? If the sponsor is too busy and is not doing anything in your project, it will struggle because it doesn't have the right kind of support. So I would suggest there is particularly or perhaps a need for understanding of the sponsor of their role. And the difference between here's your information, it's routine reporting, it's just about progress, and here is something you need to react to because. And I would suggest that you have a different way of doing those sorts of things, different way of highlighting them. And one of the things is, if I send you one of these, what do I need back from you? Now, it is very difficult to train upwards and train us to be an excellent sponsor. My suggestion would be have a conversation about how you're going to agree together. Let's be clear on how much time do they have, and if that's a risk, what can we do to mitigate those sorts of risks? So think about it in risk terms and come up with a way of doing it. Would be a way forward. If your project hasn't had clearly defined time, cost, and is more fluid, how might success failure be effectively measured? If it doesn't have clearly defined time and cost, is much more fluid, one of the things that we're to consider is what we're being asked to deliver. And if we look at things like Agile, you have fixed time and cost. You can't be late because it's fixed. What you do vary is what you deliver. Now, one of the assumptions here is that the customer doesn't need everything, and what you deliver is always the most important things first. And therefore, the success criteria would be, have I delivered all the musts? Have I delivered 80% of the shoulds? And what about some of the coulds? But it allows you to agree how big is this particular piece of work and delivered. But it would mean, of course, that everything delivered had been signed off. So quality of product, of output, would still be critical in those circumstances. If you're having an output, then perhaps benefit, what I'm trying to change. Now, if you're talking about a more fluid project or kind of an iterative basis, it may all be, what have I changed so far? So during the life of the project, we might be measuring the benefits and therefore the changes you go through. And clearly some success criteria of how many people have bought in. So things like apps, development of those, it may be how many people have downloaded it, how many people continue to download it, am I getting buy-in every time there's an upgrade, are more people replacing it and buying the upgrade? That thought process might start to generate some success or failure criteria. On a project, how can we ensure there's been an adequate client consultation to ensure trust? I mentioned earlier on a role called project assurance. project assurance is a kind of critical role that is there to assure the project on behalf of your steering group and your project board. And one of the functions in that is user assurance. And essentially, it's an independent check on the project by people who look at that. And user assurance always focuses on the product. And the question they're trying to answer is, are we getting what we asked for? So one of the things here is, if you've done some stakeholder engagement to try and gather requirements, if an independent person checked those and went, from a user perspective, I believe those are good, I've done an independent check and I'm happy, then that should satisfy your project board that it's not just what you thought, somebody else in the user community has double-checked, there's nothing obvious missing. And that, of course, gives everybody confidence to move into the next step of, are we looking for the right kind of things? Now, there is a cost to assurance, that kind of audit function, but building that in up front is the kind of the appraisal thing, means that we should be much happier that we're not delivering the wrong things as we go through. So I suggest having a look at things like roles and project assurance as a kind of solution for that one. And of course, that helps to build trust because then the board know you're doing what they have asked. To what extent does organizational culture and structure affect data? My simple answer is hugely. My more complex answer, if you have an organization where knowledge is power, then it doesn't share information very well, and you will find there's lots of difficulties in sharing information, knowledge, and what's going on in terms of project, because people will keep things because if they know more than other people, then they're in the power. And what you start to find is that you get pockets because people didn't know what was happening. If you have a more open environment, then clearly you're sharing information more widely, people will be shared, did you hear about, and therefore you start to find there's greater buy-in, greater knowledge of what's going on. So one of the things here is to consider organizational culture, what works as a cultural tool, what works as a communication tool in this organization, what are the effective tools is hugely dependent on culture. So a lot is the simple one. Do people respond? So do you have a culture of people listen but don't respond, low reactors, or people talk a lot? Again, it might tell you about buy-in. So if you have a position where people will listen but don't necessarily always say lots of things, that may not be a failure. What you might need to do is to go and ask some specific questions to work out what's going on. Moving on. So, right. Usually what I've observed is if stakeholders does not provide information, the right information, the project manager, we may have to ask for the same. Considering the stringent timelines for the project, we as project managers need to escalate to the next level of stakeholder to get the information. This may sometimes impact the relationship between the project manager and stakeholders. What would you suggest in such a scenario? Again, I guess that's kind of being open in the first place, is that if we're not getting reactions in the right time, then part of that would be, I would have to highlight. So one of the things I've actually seen people do is say, I'm coming to you for some information. If I've got limited time, if I don't get the information, I will have to escalate. So there's almost a kind of warning thing going on. It's almost being clear on why the timeline is in there. My previous answer about project assurance, if I'm collecting detail from one group of people, has somebody independently checked that before we take it forward to the next step? That independent check again gives you kind of that confirmation you've got the right kind of information going in here. That's quite good, because if you're getting it, then essentially as a project manager, if you had to go back to somebody because the assurance function said, actually we think you're missing things, then when you go back and say, actually we've had this independent check by somebody else in your organization, and they say that we need to think about 3 more areas, it's not you as the project manager going, you've done it wrong. What you're saying is, your people think there's more information to come in here, so can we explore some more? So there's a good reason for going back. And that shows that you are subject to checks by other people. It's not something you're doing just because you're being awkward. There is a reason for doing so. If it's down to the fact that people are not responding, again, it's about why are they involved, have they agreed to this particular role, and the circumstances of when you have to escalate if they're not going to do those sorts of things. So it's about trying to build relationships in the first place. I guess the truth of the matter is that you then have to have a way of escalating in order to deal with people who don't or won't, as a kind of way forward. Is the project manager responsible, in your opinion, therefore, for the stakeholder realization of the benefits? No, is the simple answer to that. Most benefits are achieved post-project, and the project manager would have moved on to something else at that particular point. Benefit realization is, I believe, down to the stakeholders, particularly the users of a product in an organization, the people who actually measure the change in performance, behavior, and all those sorts of things. What the project manager needs to understand is what they are and how they're measured, and make sure there's a plan for doing so. And of course, the problem here is that if we haven't engaged with the stakeholders and they're not aware of the change, we may deliver something useless, something wonderful, which they don't use. Or if we don't talk at the right time, we might deliver something useless. That's also, they probably won't use that as well. So it's not about the realization of benefit, it's about making sure that you've got the right things handed over so they will use it, and they should then do the realization of benefit. What you're trying to do is ensure that stakeholders or the appropriate representatives wish to change and therefore measure the benefits as well. Sometimes I do not have issues with internal stakeholders. My problem is with the external, with the client side actually. So I think what we're talking here is if we're building products which then have an external life, that stakeholders are outside as necessarily your control in the marketplace. One of the difficulties here is how we engage with that group. Now this is often about market analysis, market understanding, this may be about workshops and those sorts of things. These are expensive. Have we asked the right sort of questions? Do we know what our customers want? It is a difficult subject because it's often, have we asked the right people? Have we talked to the right kind of audience? There is a danger here that if we do lots of focus group, we focus group things to death and we deliver something so bland that nobody wants it because it's not very exciting. The danger is if we don't do enough, we deliver things that stakeholders go, this is ridiculous, I don't like it, I'll go and find something else. So there is a balance here, and often as a project manager, you may not be directly talking to those stakeholder groups. It's done via a marketing team or an external contractor or a consultant who's doing those sorts of things for you. I guess the important thing is define who we mean by a target audience, and do we believe we have a representative sample in there. You will still be doing communication to that audience. I suspect by necessity it may be one way as well. It's kind of advertising, or it's newsletters or general broadcast emails. It's those sorts of things. Where the feedback loop is only evident often when you're measuring the benefits, which is often it's failed to do so. But again, it's how we define who the target audience is, and are we looking at those sorts of people clearly. There may be a gap between you talking to them directly because it may be via another party. Have you defined your requirements to that party? Are they then doing appropriately? There is no guarantee of that, but it is being clear on who my users are, who my customers are, what kind of stakeholder representation do I want before I do those sorts of things. Defining your audience, I think, is the important one here. When stakeholders participate in strategy and planning, it means they are engaged. So why do they fail in collaborating? Stakeholder strategy and planning is about you finding those sorts of information. It's about agreeing communication roles and processes. Why do they fail in collaborating? Sometimes it's a time issue. Sometimes it's a fear issue of now the change is happening. If I ignore it, it might go away. There are perhaps no single right answer to this, so it is sometimes about going back to those groups and kind of finding out what's going wrong in terms of the collaboration, what's going wrong in terms of communication once we start doing the changes. Now, whether that's direct or whether that's via other parties depends on the nature of the communication. But it is essentially making sure it's the measuring. Are the messages getting out there? Are they understanding? Are we getting buy-in? Are we getting support? It's making sure those sorts of things happen. So it's what measures do I have? What control systems do I have in place that can pick that up so I can do something about it. Now, it may be fear of change, in which case I need to do something to address that. Or it may well be business, in which case I need to do something that says, can I make it easy for them to read and understand? Can I simplify the message? So it does depend on the reason why they're not, if you like, agreeing with the project or getting involved in the project that we need to consider. So it's to look at those in a lot more detail, I'm afraid. If there's a small project and the project fails, so it's a project failure, but how benefit is realized from it? one of the things to consider is if we're making a small change but it's not on time to budget, did it have an effect on its target audience anyway? Did they actually start to use it? Maybe not completely, but did they start to use some of the elements? And one of the things about this, one of the things to consider is, and it's a quote from David Marsh, who's done lots of writing about things, and it kind of picks up the idea of Pareto Analysis. If you've delivered 80% of what they've asked for, but 100% of people have used it, that is much better than delivering 100% of what people have asked for, but only 80% of people are using it. And the point here is, if you've delivered something but everyone's using it, the change has happened. It may not be perfect, but if the change has happened, then we can do a next step and add to it. So there may be some benefits going out. There may be not all the benefits you hope and you expect, but there's a starting point for change. If not everyone's done the change, if only 80% of people have changed, then the change hasn't fully embedded, and therefore it's much more difficult, because if we try and do the next change, there's already a group who are at least one step behind already. So it's sometimes to think about this. And when we look at Agile, we look at iterative incremental change, and so often what we're trying to do is let's get that change, get that working, and then do the next bit. So we're trying to, if I like, deliver these things so that we can move forward. And we may well accept a failure in terms of time and cost, but it's the have we changed the organisation, maybe the critical one. And although it may be considered a project delivery failure, it may be an effective project because it's got change. And so one of the things I would suggest is, when we use the term failure, are we talking about project delivery failure, it wasn't on time to budget, or are we looking at project change failure, it didn't change the organisation? And I would suggest that failure of delivery is often down to method and process, and we can learn a lot of those sorts of things, which is why Prince2 is in here and all those structures and learning are about. If we're not changing people, then there's a failure in our engagement processes and change, and therefore we need to focus on those sorts of things. Effective projects, we do both of those. And so that's the kind of thought process that comes in for it. So, yeah, Thomas Kilner is a model for change. And it looks at, model for conflict management. It identifies 5 strategies in which you may resolve conflict. And it looks at your concerns or their concerns. So it's essentially trying to address conflict between you and another party. So if you don't address your concerns or their concerns, the strategy is called avoid. We haven't really solved the conflict. It's being avoided. We've just kind of left it. If you try and resolve the conflict by getting all of your concerns resolved at the expense of theirs, it's called compete. Essentially, might is right. You force your solution on them. If you let them win, it's called accommodate. So essentially, you let them get what they wanted. The two, if you like, moving forward ones, what we have is collaborate, which is everybody gets everything they wanted. This is the perfect solution. It's not mine or yours, it's ours. We've got everything. And normally that takes some time to do so. The one in the middle is compromise. We've both got some, we've both given something up. So often when we look at negotiation, that's where we'd see compromises somewhere in the middle. And that may be the way through. I have a situation now where the sponsor rejected a change request, while the client who's actually paying us as provider has no issue with the change and is willing to do it. One of the things to consider here is why has the change request been rejected? If you have somebody who's willing to pay it, normally you'd expect the sponsor and the client would be kind of almost co-represented. So an interesting one here is that it would appear that your sponsor is an internal person and the client is the external. I would suggest that if the client is willing to pay for it, there's no issue about doing it. As long as it adds some value to the project, it may be worth doing this. The sponsor may have a reason for rejecting it. It may well be that it's actually, it may be better to hold it off and do that as a phase 2 or a future development. So it will be the reason for reject will be the important thing here, and without knowing that, it's difficult for me to comment. But it will be worthwhile knowing why they've rejected the change request, because it may be it's a simple thing, but it may be it doesn't make the system work or reduces some of the benefits to the overall. So it's the reason for reject might be the important one here, and it may well be that that might be a better step for next time round or a future development. that brings me to the end of all of the questions that have been asked so far. That's excellent. Thank you very much indeed for those questions. I'll just kind of pause gently and wait and see if we have any more questions just coming through. No questions. Right. Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. If that's all, I'd like to thank you for your contributions. Thank you for listening. Please have a look at our website and see if there's anything that can help you with this. Contact us using the social media things. Thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.